Thanks for the opportunity to speak today. I guess the starting point, I'm a lawyer in private practice. I'm not from the state government, I'm not from the council, but I do a lot of work for the council in the area of planning. I've been practicing for about 30 years now, and this will be the third generation of planning reform that I've seen in my career so far, having started under the Planning Act regime, then the Development Act regime, and now as we move to the PDI Act regime. Today's session is intended really just to provide you with a high-level overview of the reform process, which is being driven by the state government, to explain to you some of the concerns and issues that the council has identified in terms of policy reform, and I guess to encourage you insofar as you're concerned about that policy, insofar as it might affect you, to get involved and perhaps consider lodging a representation yourself. In terms of the new system, we're moving to a new piece of legislation which will introduce a radically different planning scheme to what we're used to at present. There will be an emphasis on the facilitation of development, and there will be very different processes for seeking approval for development, including decision makers will change too. There'll be a whole range of different relevant authorities who will be making planning decisions. It will no longer just be the council and its assessment panel, but it's contemplated under the new system that there will be accredited professionals, private people, who will be issuing certain forms of planning approvals, in addition to council staff and council assessment panels. One of the real changes, though, will be the rule book or the policies against which development applications in the future are assessed, insofar as we will be moving from a situation where each council has their own development plan with their own planning rules and policies, to a situation where we will have a single planning and design code which will be relevant for planning assessment across the whole of the state. The state government has undertaken consultation in a phased manner. In relation to the regions, consultation closed on the 29th of November, and up until last Friday it was intended that the new system would commence operation in the regions on the 1st of April this year. And insofar as Metropolitan Adelaide is concerned, consultation closes on the 28th of February, and it was originally intended that the new system would commence on the 1st of July. As of last Friday, the Minister announced that, based on advice that he'd received from the Commission, that things weren't quite ready for commencement, and based on submissions that he'd received, he took the view that further time was required to enable the community to get up to speed and local government to get up to speed insofar as the new system is concerned. So the implementation of that new assessment regime has been delayed. For the regions, it will now commence on the 1st of July, so that's been pushed back. And for Metropolitan Adelaide, including obviously the city of Burnside, the new system won't commence before at least September this year. So while there's been a deferment in the implementation of the new system, consultation will still close at the end of this month. So insofar as representations are to be made, that 28th February is still the deadline date. Why are we moving to a new system? The rationale given by the state government is that there is an intention for simplification of the system, a desire for greater standardisation of policy and less variation of policy across council areas. The desire is for a greater consistency in outcomes, whether you're undertaking development in Burnside, Walkerville, Campbelltown or Prospect. So the state government is developing an online planning portal which will deliver planning services in the future. So policies will be available online, applications will be lodged online, and you'll be able to check the process of particular applications as they go through the system. The desire is to move to a more performance-based planning policy with greater qualitative policy, more flexibility, less prescription and a greater degree of subjectivity. So what's that going to look like? All of the state's development plans will be replaced by a single planning and design code which will operate on an online or in an online environment. So there will be a rationalisation of planning policy and a standardisation of that policy to a large degree. It's been quite a challenging task for council planning staff to analyse what is proposed, because at the present time that has taken the form of a hard copy code, over 3,000 pages. It's been difficult in terms of undertaking that exercise because ultimately the system is designed to operate in an online environment, and yet consultation has been in a hard copy environment, which has given rise to challenges. Notwithstanding that, the Commission has advised that in moving or transitioning to the code, there will be 4 significant areas of policy reform. And those are in the areas of renewable energy, value adding in rural areas, and I guess of most concern to us in the city of Burnside, the area of heritage and character and the area of urban infill. And it's those 2 latter topics which we'll concentrate on this evening. Apart from those 4 areas where the Commission has said there will be policy change, the other expressed intention is that otherwise in all other areas it is our intention to transition existing planning policy and to review that policy over time. Burnside Council, I guess like many others, have, in analysing over 3,000 pages of proposed draft policy, have identified a number of mapping errors, omissions, some inconsistencies where policy has changed. Now that's probably not surprising when one considers the enormity of the task of concertining 72 development plans into a single code. The question though is whether those inconsistencies and those omissions and those policy changes are intentional or rather inadvertent as a result of the transition itself. Staff have certainly engaged in an ongoing dialogue with Deputy staff where they have raised those issues and concerns, and that has been a positive and constructive engagement process, and they'll continue to do that in addition to incorporating any concerns as to policy change within their formal submission. One observation I make, I guess, is that inevitably when you standardise policy, there must be some form of policy change for some councils, perhaps more than others. So we're moving to from a development plan, I should say, which is zoned based, which articulates uses and separates inconsistent uses from each other, to a scenario where we're moving away from detailed policy areas with envisaged uses and existing character and desired character as expressed in the current development plan, to a code which is going to have a very different structure to what we're familiar with in relation to council development plans, where we have zones, policy areas and general provisions, and provisions that relate to public notification and referrals. So briefly, what will the new code look like? It's comprised, or will be comprised, of 10 parts. Most of the policy is contained in parts 2 to 5, where zones will be set out, subzones, overlays and general policies, and we'll talk about those in a general way shortly. There will be local variations which will be dealt with in part 6 of the code, where it's intended that local characteristics will be specified and that those characteristics or variations will vary general zone policy. So they will deal with things like minimum allotment sizes, minimum frontage widths, maximum height, maximum and minimum site and floor cover and site coverage. In terms of what they look like, they are generally spatially based and general provisions. The new concept of overlays is to be introduced, and the overlays, there are 59 draft overlays currently in the proposal plan. They contain additional policies that apply across zones. They relate to all manner of things currently, such as hazards, so flooding, sloping land, regulated trees, design and heritage are but a few examples. Those overlays will apply across the whole of the council area and they will override zone provisions. Zone provisions will, as they do today, govern generally the use and development of an area and include procedural matters relating to what forms of development will be notified and to whom. Within zones, there will also be the concept of sub-zones, which will contain additional policies with respect to the character of a particular part of a zone, similar to what we recognise today as policy areas. Non-spatial provisions of the zone, non-spatial provisions of the code will contain general provisions that will apply across the whole of the council area, and they will be based on development type, examples of which are land division, site contamination, transport and parking. We often get asked which rules are the most important, which predominate when there are inconsistencies. And the hierarchy, generally speaking, is that the specific will prevail over the more general. So at the top of the tree will be these overlays which apply across the state. They will cross zone boundaries. Multiple overlays might apply to a particular land parcel. So those will be the most important provisions in any planning assessment. The next level of detail will be subzones, which contain policies that will vary the policy in the parent zone to reflect local characteristics and circumstances. Then we'll have the zone provisions and then the general provisions. So in terms of what it means for Burnside, the current draft code reduces probably hundreds of zones across the 72 development plans across the state into 56 zones, 4 of which will be residential zones. And there will be 25, at least in the current draft, 25 subzones. When we look at the Burnside development plan, while there is a single residential zone, that residential zone is divided up into 29 specific and unique policy areas, each of which have their own desired character, each of which have specific policy as to the type and form of development contemplated within each of those unique 29 policy areas. In relation to heritage and historic conservation, there is a single historic conservation zone, but again that too is divided up into 9 unique and specific policy areas with their own provisions as to the types of development that are contemplated and an emphasis on conservation and retention of properties that contribute to the described historic character unique to each of those 9 policy areas. How is heritage and character to be transitioned into the code? Local heritage places and historic conservation zones will be transitioned by way of overlays. It's the Commission's stated intention that all current local heritage places will directly transition into the code, and insofar as those of you who live within a historic conservation zone, those properties and their policy areas will also transition into the code, not via a specific zone, but via an overlay, which will be called the historic area overlay. Within that, there will no longer be the individual identification of contributory items, and that has been the source of some debate in the community generally, and particularly at a local government level. So there will be specific overlays that deal with heritage. There'll be a state heritage overlay that deals with state heritage places and areas, a local heritage place overlay, which deals with local heritage places, and a historic area overlay, which will replace our current historic conservation zone. That will be supplemented by historic area statements that will speak to the unique areas of value. So it's contemplated that in respect of the 9 current policy areas within the historic conservation zone, they will be the subject of 9 separate historic area statements, which hopefully will describe the unique characteristics of each of those 9 areas. So these overlays will be the principal tool for heritage and character controls in the code, and these overlays will override zone policy. So while in the future you may be in a suburban neighbourhood zone or a general neighbourhood zone, those of you who are presently in a historic conservation zone, over the top of those new residential zones will be this historic area overlay. Each of the historic area statements will have a different level, each of those overlays will have a different level of protection and a different unique set of development controls in relation to demolition, the design for replacement buildings, policies for alterations and additions, and for conservation works. The loss, or I guess the non-preparedness of the Commission at the present time to carry over contributory items has been a concern to local government in terms of leading to arguably a greater degree of uncertainty and inconsistency for applicants for approval and for residents. I've put up on the screen one of the policy areas within the city, and that's the Rose Park policy area. And for those of you that can see the screen, all of those properties with a circle are designated currently as contributory items. So looking at Rose Park as an example, it is a very intact, consistent policy area where pretty much 99.9% of the properties are identified as contributory places. I guess the point I'd like to make that in the case of the Rose Park policy area, the designation of individual contributory items is not as essential because it's a consistent area. In other policy areas where there's not the same degree of consistency, one might say that there will be less certainty with those contributory items no longer being identified. At the end of the day, the important thing though is getting the policy right, because it will be the policy and the demolition controls in the overlay itself that will provide the protection, not necessarily the individual identification of contributory items. However, certainly their continued identification does assist in terms of certainty, and I think that's a concern that will be expressed to the Commission in submissions from the LGA, and I expect also the City of Burnside. So the intention is that there will be a universal policy applying in the future to deal with heritage places and to deal with historic area overlays, which will replace historic conservation zones. It's very important that insofar as you are looking at the draft plan to ensure, given the universal policy overlay that will apply, to ensure that the proposed draft historic area statements do truly reflect and are consistent with the policies that currently exist in the 9 individual policy areas for the historic conservation zone. In terms of what are the demolition controls, for local heritage places, they're currently identified in the Council's development plan. As I said, they will be carried forward in the code. In terms of demolition, considerations will be the existing heritage value of the relevant portion of the property. So if someone is looking at knocking off a rear extension that doesn't contribute to the local heritage value, they'll be able to do that. Equal considerations will relate to the structural integrity of the building, and someone who wants to demolish a local heritage place will need to establish that the structural integrity or condition of their building represents an unacceptable risk to safety and is irredeemably beyond repair. So economic considerations won't be relevant. Whether that person neglects their property won't be relevant. So they'll need to establish that the condition of the building is such that it's unsafe, and as a matter of practical reality, it's irredeemably beyond repair. The stated intention of the government is, like the case with state heritage places, a person should not be able to neglect their property, let it go to rack and ruin, let squatters come in, and then use that as a justification for a future demolition application. While that's the expressed intention in some fact sheets that have been released, that's not currently what the draft policy says, so that will be a subject of submission by the Council. In terms of the historic area overlay, which will replace our historic conservation zone, historic area statements, as I said, will replace what we see today in our development plan as desired character statements, and they will identify the key elements and historic characteristics of a particular area, so that the 9 current policy areas. Those statements will then be used to interpret the policies within the historic area overlay. In terms of the demolition tests, and this has been a concern for local government in terms of retaining properties, there is an emphasis based on the current draft policy on front elevations and building facades. Equally, if someone is looking to demolish a property within the historic area overlay, they will need to establish that the structural integrity or condition of that building is beyond economic repair. So there'll be an economic financial test introduced as to whether the costs involved in rehabilitation and repair are economical compared to the costs associated with the replacement structure or building. So that will be the subject too, I think, of submissions as to whether that is an appropriate test, and also whether there should be a greater emphasis beyond simply front elevations and building facades. Wendy will speak shortly in relation to the specifics, but regarding the proposal for residential zones within the city, the code proposes only 4 residential zones, 3 of which are proposed to currently apply to Burnside. Wendy will talk shortly in terms of detail and where they are proposed, but in broad terms, the zone that is proposed for the majority of the council's area is the suburban neighbourhood zone. That's a zone that contemplates lower density development and incorporates heritage and character areas. So that's a positive. It contemplates larger site areas, and it incorporates technical and numeric variations, hopefully to reflect existing policy. So variations in setbacks, building heights, site cover, etc. The council's desire ultimately, is that all of its residential area be placed in this suburban neighbourhood zone where there can be variations to the standard policy. Some of the council's area, though, is presently proposed to be situated within the general neighbourhood zone. Most of the residential land in Greater Adelaide is proposed to be in that zone. That is a zone that contemplates a greater range of dwelling types and a greater range of non-residential uses, significantly lower minimum site areas compared to what we have at present, and no specific local variations. The third zone, and there's only a small pocket of land within the city proposed to be zoned housing diversity, contemplates low-rise, medium density, terrace housing, group dwellings and residential flats. And currently there are no sub-zones proposed. So in terms of what are the key areas or key concerns at present when we're looking at the policy that's proposed, we need to be careful with a one-size-fits-all approach. Less policy and less detail does not necessarily more. I think often it means less. We need to be careful that the detailed, refined policy that the council has developed over the years is not lost in the transition to a single code. We need to ensure that contextual design remains an important consideration in development assessment. In terms of the historic area overlay, which will replace our historic conservation zone, we need to carefully consider whether the loss of identified contributory items is a good thing or not. We need to reflect and review the proposed demolition criteria. And in respect of residential areas, I think it'll be the case that the council will be saying, look, we either need all of our area in the suburban neighbourhood zone with its own local variations that reflect existing policies, or we'd like some additional zones and sub-zones, because really it's the suburban neighbourhood zone that allows the greatest opportunity for variations to reflect existing policy with respect to site area, setbacks, site cover and the like. So until we see the final system, the portal is still under construction, and at least the push out of the commencement date will afford local government a greater opportunity to road test the system, hopefully in the true electronic environment in which it is proposed to operate. And ultimately there'll be a period of transition presumably once we do start in September, and a degree of uncertainty, I guess, as we get used to the new system and how that will operate. And with those general observations, I will hand over to Wendy.
All right, well, how does this affect us specifically in Burnside, and how does this affect you in your street? Let's now have a look at some of the implications of what Gavin has talked about. Firstly, Gavin informed us that the code essentially takes a one-size-fits-all policy to development right across the entire state. And when we look in a little more detail in a minute at the residential areas in particular, we'll see that the code takes a key theme of intensification of development. So what we're concerned about when we've had a look through this draft document is that this has the potential of reducing our valued character throughout the city of Burnside. And in Council's submission on the code, we're requesting broadly that we match the existing conditions, that in some places we look at adding additional zones, and in all situations we look at addressing the policy to ensure that it's appropriate and it is similar to provide similar outcomes to what we currently have. So we've been working as a council and having ongoing discussions with DIPT, and they've been receptive to some of the concerns that we've raised, and they've asked us to make sure that we put those concerns in our submission and also to encourage our community to do the same. They've essentially said that the more people across the state who say the same thing, it will help give a stronger and a clearer message of the key concerns that people are having with this draft document, and enable them, when they present the material to the State Planning Commission and the Minister, Stephen Knoll, to be able to give a stronger voice of what the people of Adelaide are saying. So let's look at some specifics. In our residential areas, as Gavin said, we currently have one residential zone with 29 different policy areas, and each of these different policy areas enable us to have a variation in the character and the nature and the desired form of development that occurs there. So we have different criteria for such things as the density, the allotment size, the heights and the frontage widths. And as Gavin mentioned, in the code for Burnside, all of our various different policy areas will be located in one of 3 neighbourhood zones. And these range in intensity, and the suburban neighbourhood zone is the one which enables us to have more variation and include a lot of our local variations. But the housing diversity neighbourhood zone and the general neighbourhood zone are zones which cover development right across the state, and we're unable to have local variations in those 2 zones. So let's look at where they've been allocated by the draft code. Most of our council has been placed in the suburban neighbourhood zone, and that is the pink area that you see on the map. But there also is a large proportion highlighted in yellow, and that is what the code proposes to be general neighbourhood zone. There's also a small area around the Amber Woods area where the code proposes housing neighbourhood diversity zone. So, sorry, that's housing diversity neighbourhood zone. Let's have a look at what those specifically mean in terms of looking what can be done if we consider an example block. So currently, for example, in Linden Park, we have minimum site areas which range from 350 square metres to 500 square metres. And if, for example, we take a 600 square metre allotment, a typical one in Linden Park, currently we can't subdivide that allotment because if it was in a 350 area, you would need a minimum of 700 square metres to subdivide. If now that area has been rezoned as the general neighbourhood zone, we can look at having 3 row houses in that location, because the general neighbourhood zone allows a minimum of 200 square metres for row houses or 300 square metres for a detached or semi-detached dwelling. If we then look at translating that same block of land into the housing diversity zone, that zone envisages 70 dwellings per hectare, which amounts to about 140 square metres per dwelling. So in that location, the same block of land which we can't currently subdivide in Linden Park would enable 4 separate dwellings on that site. Obviously, this would significantly increase traffic and parking and noise, and facilitate loss of trees, vegetation and amenity if people proceeded to uptake the opportunities that the code presents them. So our council in the submission, which went to council last night, is requesting that all our residential areas be located in the suburban neighbourhood zone, which enables us to have the flexibility of reflecting a lot of the existing criteria that we currently have. In addition to that, Gavin mentioned that the code introduces overlays. One overlay is called a character area overlay. And this overlay, it doesn't control demolition, but what it does is it requires developers or people who are looking at doing extensions in that area to have more consideration for the local context in that particular area. Now, initially we were advised that it was only councils who currently had character areas designated in their current development plans who would be allowed to translate those into the character area overlay. But as we as a council have been having our ongoing discussions with DIPTI, they have been receptive to including some of our older suburbs into that overlay. We don't know what the boundaries would be. The indication is that it would be roughly around the orange area indicated on that map. And these are discussions that we have had in the past with them, and it will be up to them to ultimately determine the boundaries. Clearly, it would not be across the entire council, and it would be restricted more to those areas where there is older and established dwellings. Now, Gavin's also told us about the historic area overlay. Currently, our historic buildings, by and large, are located in our existing historic conservation zone, and they will then be translated across to the historic area overlay. Currently across the state, there's a huge variation in the way in which councils treat their heritage buildings. So for some councils, they take a very high view of their heritage and they have stronger protections. For other councils, they are a little bit more receptive to replacement buildings in those areas, particularly if those areas aren't as intact. So for what we have seen as we've looked through the code, we've found that the code introduces far more generic and less specific policy than is in our current development plan. And we, along with a number of other neighbouring councils like Norwood and Unley, are concerned that this is indeed a weakening of our policy. And so the Commission has set the bar somewhere between those people who consider that they have a higher protections on their property and those that are lower. And so for those councils where the bar has been set above, for them there will be a strengthening of policy. But for those of us who see that the policy is in fact quite different in some respects and less specific, we see that then as a weakening of our policy, and that is a concern to us. The other issue that you may have seen literature about heritage protection in the media relates to the term demolition control, and sometimes that can be a confusing term for people. Demolition control doesn't mean you cannot demolish a building. What it means is that you are required to submit a development application requesting if you can demolish that building. And the answer, yes or no, to that question is dependent on the demolition criteria against which that application is assessed. So obviously, if the demolition criteria is strong, you're more likely to receive a no answer, and if it's weaker, you're more likely to receive a yes answer. The demolition criteria is the policy which is within the code itself. And so we're very concerned that that policy is strong and offers the same level of protection that we have for our existing historic buildings. Gavin mentioned the issue of contributory items. In the city of Burnside, contributory items are those particular buildings within our existing historic conservation areas which were constructed at the time of original subdivision for those areas. So it might be, for example, Tusmore is an interwar era, so it would be the buildings which were all constructed during that interwar period are considered to be contributory items, and they are identified on the map with the circles. So anyone who wants to know whether a particular building is of historic significance in an area can open the development plan, look on a map, and clearly they can see one way or the other. If there's a dot on there, a circle, that means that is a significant building in that historic area. And if there's no dot on the map, then it's that building is not of significance, and they can look at putting in a new dwelling in that location. So it's clear in the sense that when people ring up, I want to buy a property, we can direct them and say, let's see what the map says. Some councils, instead of having a map, they have a list of addresses. Once you remove that, we're left in a state where somebody has to actually go through an assessment process to find out whether that particular building is of historic value to the area. And that creates uncertainty and subjectivity and inconsistency across councils. So one of the things that we are asking for is that our contributory items remain specifically identified within the new code. Well, let's look at some of the issues that we've identified across all residential areas that may be of concern. Under the code, the minimum setbacks from boundaries, both at ground level and upper level of a building, is reduced from what we currently have. So currently, if your next door neighbour wants to build, for example, a 2-storey building, the upper level of that 2-storey building is required to be 4 metres from your side boundary and 8 metres from your rear boundary if you're backing onto them. Under the code, that is reduced so that the upper level only needs to be 1.9 metres from your boundary at the side, and the upper level only needs to be 5 metres from the rear boundary. Obviously, this has implications on privacy, overlooking, overshadowing, and the general amenity of your area. And in addition to that, it will impact the streetscape and what is actually seen as you drive down the street. Another area that the code changes the way things are currently for us is that the site coverage is increased. So that means that the amount of land covered by the building is going to be greater than it currently is. So this leads to less private open space on the land, and obviously a greater bulk and scale of the actual building that's going there, and consequently the potential for less trees and less vegetation. And both these aspects will impact the streetscape of the neighbourhood. Another change relates to land use. So currently in our residential areas, most non-residential uses are classed as non-complying. So it's only a small, for example, a little small consulting room, which acts perhaps as a home business, that is permissible, so long as it doesn't heavily impact traffic or parking or noise in your area. But under the code allows many non-residential uses within our residential areas. They're actually called envisaged uses. So for example, offices, educational facilities, shops, and standalone consulting rooms are all considered to be envisaged uses within residential areas. So that means next door to you or within your street, someone could convert their building to an office or an educational facility or a shop, or they could choose to knock it down and replace it with a two-storey office or a shop. And if you're in a historic area, they might need to retain the front of the building, but they could still build on a two-storey development at the rear as a shop or an office. So this is very different to what we currently have in Burnside. And we are requesting that the code changes this so that what is allowable in residential areas is the same as what we currently have. And that may mean something more like a new residential zone, or somehow changing the suburban neighbourhood zone policy to reflect this. Another thing that's changing in the new code is public notification. So currently in Burnside Council, if your next door neighbour wants to replace the building next door with a 2-for-1 building, a semi-detached, or 2 or more dwellings next door to you, or if they want to build a new 2-storey development next to you, or if they wanted to change their use, for example, shops or consulting rooms, you would be notified. And you would be given an opportunity to have your say and to comment. Under the code, that opportunity is removed. You're no longer notified if any of these particular functions will occur. So naturally, if you don't have your say, there will be no opportunity or avenue for you to make an appeal against what's going next door. And of course, we can see how that is very different to the way things are in most of our council. All right, well, what's happening now also in our commercial and business areas? There's also a big change in the policy there. Currently across the state, commercial and retail centres, there is a hierarchy of development policy, so that the large centres have policy applicable to them, and the medium centres different policy, and the smaller ones local policy. So in our council, for example, we have a district centre zone with particular policy for the Burnside village, because that's our largest commercial retail centre. We then have neighbourhood centre zone with appropriate policy for our medium-sized centres like Marriotteville or Frueville. And then we have local centre zone, which is tailored to the different needs of different local centres, like Devereux Road, like Dulwich Village, like the Corner Deli on the end of your street. So the policy is tailored to the location and the sort of use that goes on, and essentially reflects the environment in which it's located. Under the code, all those variations go out, and everything is located in one zone called the Suburban Activity Centre Zone. So the same policy that applies to the district centre applies to the neighbourhood centre and also to the Corner Deli down the road from you. So I think you can see how that is somewhat of a concern. We've had discussions, in fact, many councils have had discussions with the state government about this and expressed concern that our small local centres are in the same policy bucket as the large district ones. They have said that the technical and numerical variation aspect will be applied, so that at least enables us, for example, to cap heights at our for our corner deli, so that it won't end up as a 6-storey building. But there's also a lot of other policy which hasn't and isn't able to be addressed in the TNV, and so we are asking that the code brings in a new zone that specifically addresses the needs of our small local centres. Well, how do all these things impact what happens to our green leafy suburbs? The code also introduces some changes. So currently in our development policy, we have significant tree policy and separate regulated tree policy. We also have certain environmental criteria. The new code takes a different approach. It lumps all of that into one overlay, and consequently the policy is concertinaed, I think was the word Gavin used, and that has the potential of losing key detail and content in what is finalised. Also, the language and the content of the policies is different, and we consider it to be a weaker form of policy. And as I said, the environmental criteria for such things as biodiversity and habitat is excluded entirely from the code. So this is a concern for us. In addition to the various facts that the issues that I've raised regarding increased infill development, such as the minimum site areas reducing, the setbacks reducing, the site coverage increasing, and consequently street crossovers numbers would increase. All of this potentially results in canopy loss, shade loss, the loss of habitat, and the loss of climate resilience. So, in summary, the key issues that we've looked at, we've seen how the increased density has potential for impacting our amenity, character and trees in terms of the setbacks, the site coverage, the land use, and the lack of notification of neighbours. And we've also said that as a council we are requesting some changes when it comes to zones, and that all our residential areas match existing and are located in either a suburban neighbourhood zone with appropriate technical details changed to match our existing, or that somehow there is some sort of new residential zone introduced. And that we're also requesting some changes to the zones within our commercial and business areas. Okay, so what can we all do about this? We as a council have put together our technical submission that went to the meeting at council last night, and so you can have a look at that on the website online. We've also been asked by a number of residents what do they put in their submission, and they've asked us if we could provide them some examples or some samples, and so we've been able to do that. And if you go to our website to engage Burnside, you will see that there are some sample letters tailored to each different ward. There's also a generic one across the whole of council if you want to hit all of the issues that I've raised today. But if you just want to address the key issues for your ward, go to the website, go to Engage Burnside and click on the example that's tailored to your ward. As you're aware, this is our last community information session. We've had 4 of them, and we trust that they've been of benefit to you. Bernie mentioned that some of this information will also be online. We've also had a request very recently to provide a written record, if you like, of some of the things that I've mentioned and some of the concerns that we've raised in our submission that went to Council last night. So we've produced a flyer, and currently Australia Post are, I hope, folding it up and about to send it off to you, and you should get it within the next few days. So can I encourage you to read the material and please put in a submission. DIPTI are not taking paper submissions. Everything has to be sent online, either through their planning portal or via email. And if you have problems with doing that, then have a chat, have a look on our website and have a chat to someone at Council. All submissions have to be in by the 28th of February.